First, let's hack into the box. So what we'll try is a password attack. And I'll use a password list in the user share word list directory. That's called rockutxt. So user share word lists. You'll see there is a password list here. I'm gonna use that for the attack. Copy it to my home directory and extract here. So the password list is in user share word lists, and it's a compressed file, so you need to right click and click extract here. That created the password list, so it's a list of commonly used passwords which we'll use for the attack. And I'll use a tool called Hydra to do the attack. But first we'll need to scan for what service is it running. Is it running a web service? Is it running a secure shell service, file sharing service, and so on. We can do that with nmap. So we do a scan on the server's IP address, on the server's internet address. You'll see I got the wrong IP. Okay, it is running one service. And next you might want to know the username. So either you could use a list of usernames, so you could create one, or you could install one. For example, one list of usernames is in the package seclist, so you could install seclist. Or you could search the internet for commonly used usernames, because we'll need both username and password. So let's take a look. So I'm gonna download this list of usernames. It's a part of seclist that you can install. So the file is called names.txt. Just click raw here. And then this URL, I'm gonna get it. So wget, download this file, paste selection, and that downloads the list of usernames. So it's just a list of usernames, it's the same as this one. You'll see it's part of the seclist repository. So if you go to github.com and search for seclists, you'll see usernames here, and then names, and then you have names.txt. So I'm gonna use that. So we know from the scan of nmap that is running a secure shell service. And what we'll do is a password attack with both username and password lists. So -l names.txt -p with the password list, // colon the IP address. So what it will do is try every username and every password in that list. So once I press enter, obviously it's gonna take a while because it's trying from all the usernames and all the passwords. And there's lots of usernames and lots of passwords. So if you happen to know the username, maybe because it's prompting that, or maybe it's written on the website, or in some other way that you know the username, that can save you a lot of time. Because then you only need to find out the password, you don't need to find out the username anymore. So let's say we actually know the username. So in this case, we know the username is Alice, so I'm gonna try that. So if you know the username, use the lowercase l. If you want to use a list of usernames, capital case L with Hydra. So like this. I'm gonna press enter. And now it uses username Alice because it's lowercase, but it's still trying with all the passwords, with the password list to crack it. And still it's gonna take a moment, but it should find the passwords if it is in the list. So that took a while, but we found the username and password here. So we can press Ctrl+C to quit because we found the username and password, or you can wait longer if you want to. But we have the username password, so we put that in a note. And you'll see now we can use this to log in. So it's SSH that we cracked. Remember that when we type the command, we specified // : that is the protocol. So now we can type Alice at the IP address. With the password. So now we're in the box and we can type, for example, who am I? It will tell Alice. Which groups am I part of? So it will tell you basic information, and any Linux system has a root user, OOT, which is the system administrator. So the next step is to try and become administrator into the system and not just a regular user. So let's try and become the system administrator or the root user. So what we can do is to gather some information from the computer. With the command uname, you can print a lot of information about the system. You can either print just the core system version, so this -R would print the core system version. So the Linux version, you'll see 5.15.55. You can use -A to print everything about the system, or you might do some subselect of it. So it's running system version 5.15.55. Let's see if we can find an exploit for that. So an exploit is like a program that makes you root or abuses the system. So we'll install a tool called Linux Exploit Suggester and see if that works. So we'll go into cd user share Linux Exploit Suggester, and then we're gonna run that with version, so -K with the same version, and see if there's any exploits. And you'll see no exploits. So bad news for that is not running old Linux version that we can easily abuse. Next, maybe we can find something in the history file. So every Linux has a history file. So you can output that with the cat command, pet, and it's the history file. So you'll see it's Alpine here, which is a different distribution of Linux. Instead of bash_Linux, it has a file called bash_history. And you'll see some commands had been run, but nothing that could, like, no wrongly typed password is in here. Next, we could try to see if we can run anything as administrator. So with the sudo command, it lets you run things as administrator. Usually it requires password for all programs, but not always. So let's see if we can do that. And you'll see sudo command not found. So you might think, okay, there is no way to get root in this system. Kernel is up to date. The bash history doesn't contain anything. We cannot run anything as sudo. There's more things we can try, right? For example, we could try just to brute force the root account, see if it allows root login. So I'm gonna exit, and for Hydra, instead of Alice, I'm gonna specify the root user. So root with the password. Another thing you could try is to use Alice's password, so the password we were for the user, and see if it has the same password for root. Or we might try just to brute force it. So we just change the username to root, the system administrator, and see if we can crack the password. And you see, there we go, we have the root password. So now we would be able to log in. And you'll see now I am root, so we were able to just brute force it as the. Another thing we might, okay, so we can store this, we are root now. Maybe there were other ways to get root in this box as well, instead of just brute forcing. So let me try to log in as the Alice. See, there's no files in this directory. Maybe we can just see the root directory. No, we can't. So yeah, one of the ways we got root is just to brute force it. So sometimes that is the way, and not every way has to work, right? So you just need one way to become root. In this case, it allowed root login for SSH, which is why we could log in with the password. So I'm gonna hack another computer. This is another server on my local network. So first thing we'll do is to scan and see which applications are running. Now note that this server doesn't exist on your network. So this will only work on my box, but the principles will work with any server. So we're gonna scan it, and you'll see it's running two applications, our web server, HTTP, and it's running an SSH server. So we might try and open the web page. We can type the IP address and see what web page is running and see if we can find some login or some web vulnerability, or we could try and brute force SSH again. So we can use Hydra to brute force. Or let's first try to connect to it. So connect to the IP address with SSH, see if it gives us any information. So no information there. When we did the scan, it tells us Ubuntu. So I might try to open it with the web browser. So, and see what it actually tells. So it's a Ubuntu computer apparently. We might check with web developer tools. So both Chrome and Firefox have web developer tools. And I'm gonna click on network, reload, and click on the slash here, the first one. If you scroll down, we can see it's running Ubuntu with Apache 2.4.7. Okay, so we know it's running Ubuntu. Perhaps the username is Ubuntu, or we can take a look at Ubuntu default usernames. So what is the default username in Linux? So it depends. The default username and password for Ubuntu is Ubuntu. Alright, so you can find out that is the default username. Let's see if they're using the default username. So we're gonna use Hydra to do a brute force attack. Hydra -l Ubuntu -p with the password list, and then we can either attack SSH or the web, because those are the two services that are open. We're gonna do SSH. So SSH :/ with the IP address. And once now it's cracking the server, the SSH access, using the Ubuntu user. So if that user exists, which it does, it might find the password. So now we found the username and password. We have initial access because we did a brute force attack. So I'm gonna save it to a note. And it's very useful to keep notes, because you might discover many things when you try to hack into the box. And it's useful to keep notes of that. So I'm gonna log in now with the user Ubuntu. Asks us the password. So that's the one we cracked. And now we have default user access. So basic access into the system. But of course we want to become root. We want to become administrator into this box. Users can be part of the sudo group. The sudo group lets you run commands as root. So we can type groups commands to see which groups we are part of. And you'll see, in this case, we are part of the sudo group. So we might be able to run one or more commands as root. To check that out, we can type sudo -l and see which commands we can run as root. And you'll see 2 lines here, and it says all, no password, all. So we can run all commands as root. So let's try just sudo bin bash. And now we are root into the system, right? It says root. If I type who am I am now system administrator. So we now have full access over this computer, because we could run any command as root with the sudo command. So sometimes the sudo command is protected, or usually it is, and you would need the password to log in. The sudo command lets you run any command as a root user, even when you're not root. So obviously, in most systems it requires a password. So you would type sudo with whatever command you want to do. Let's say output the shadow file, and then it would ask the password because this file is owned by root. So whatever command, sudo, for example, list, would run the list command as the root user. And in most configurations on Linux systems, it requires a root password to do so. However, one thing to know is that the sudo command, old versions of the sudo command, so for the last 10 years from 1.8.2 all the way up to 1.9.5, were vulnerable. They had a security hole on them, a security flaw, and that allowed you to become root without knowing the password. So we can check first the version of the sudo command. So sudo -- version. You'll see that the version here is 1.8.9. Now, as I said, legacy versions of sudo, so 1.8.9 all the way up to 1.9.5, were vulnerable to a security flaw. And this flaw allowed you to become root without knowing the password, without knowing the sudo password. So you would do sudo -u, specify the user, and it will do so with the identifier. So a user ID is anywhere between 0 and some high number. But instead of specifying some high number, we specify -1. So obviously there is no user with user ID -1. What this will do is cause a so-called buffer overflow. So user IDs are anywhere between 0 and all the way up some high number. But if we specify -1, obviously the program is not a correct input for the program. -1 will cause the program to bypass it and then become root instantly. So just by adding this argument, and that's all, and pressing enter, that should give us root access. So now we specify a command to run, for example ls, and it just ran the ls command as root. Now, not very interesting because we are still the Ubuntu user. So what we can do instead is to start a new shell, for example the bash shell. The bash shell is the command line interface that you're using. So now we run the bash shell as the root user. So this will start the root shell. Now we are the administrator or the system user, because this sudo version was vulnerable to this exploit. So the exploit creates uses the -1 user, which doesn't exist, and then sudo makes it automatically root, and it runs the shell as root, and we are root. So with the old version of the sudo commands, you can become root just with one line of text. One single command makes you root in old versions of sudo. So you can check if it's vulnerable by typing sudo space -l, sudo -- version, and if it is anything less than 1.9.5, so anything between 1.8 something to 1.95, it is vulnerable, and you can become root with just one line, one single command. So just running this command gives us root access. So we did privilege escalation using a vulnerable sudo. Sometimes users make mistakes, for example, typing the password wrong, and other mistakes. So we can see historic commands with the history command. So if we type history, we can see historic commands, and you'll see all kind of things that happened here. And you'll see here something that might be a password, right? So su typed here with 2 U's and then password. So what we can do is just to try it. Another way to look at this file is opening the file bash history. You can say cat, which outputs the file content, space .bash history, shows all the historic commands. So either history or bash history. So let's try that. Let's see if this is the actual password, su, and you see we are root. So it was super easy now because the administrator made a mistake by typing the password in with a wrong command and not deleting it from the file, from the history command. So the history, When you type history, you can see all the historic commands that the user typed. And sometimes a user types their password wrong. And in that case, you know the password just by looking at the history commands. So if they don't clear their history and they made a mistake typing their password, you can see that in the history commands or the file .bash history. So just by browsing the history, you can sometimes find the passwords. Sometimes a sudo command is protected by the system administrator and they only allow specific commands to be run. For example, we can check that with sudo -l to see which commands we can run as root. So it says here we can run the time command and the man command as root. Time just measures the time of an execution program. So for example, time with the whatever you want to do. So let's say sleep 2 seconds, and it will measure the time that this command takes. The other command, when we listed the commands we can run as root, is the man command. Man shows man pages you might have used before. You can find information about any command with man, whatever web page, for example ls, and tells you the manual page of it. Press Q to quit. So it seems harmless, right? We can run 2 commands as root user. So the system administrator might think that, okay, who cares that those commands can be run? Well, we can abuse certain commands to gain root access. So if we open Firefox and we go to a website called GTFO bins. So search for GTFO bins. If you search for GTFO bins or go directly to gtfobins.github.io, click on sudo, and you can find commands that can be abused to gain root access. So here we have the command, the user bin time, that we can run as root. So sudo -l tells us which commands we can run as root, which are time and man in this case. So I'm gonna scroll down all the way to time and scroll down here, and it says sudo. So sudo with this command should give us root access. So let's paste it. And I type who am I? I am now root. So let's go back to the regular shell. You'll see also man here that we can run as root. So let's see if we can use the man page to get root shell. So man here, sudo. So sudo man. And then it wants us to type !bin sh. So !bin sh. Who am I? I'm now root. So running any of those commands, if we type sudo -l and we find commands, we might be able to escalate our privileges. If you go to GTFO bins, you can find a list of commands that are vulnerable to this type of attack. If any of those commands are allowed to run, then we can use those commands to become root in the system. So whatever command is vulnerable, for example tar, you can use tar to gain root access as well. But in this case tar is not listed, so that's why we cannot use that command. So only the commands listed, so sudo -l to list the commands we can run as root, and then look for those commands on GTFO bins to see if we can, if it's in there. So in this case the time command is in here, and we can find, when we scroll in this list on GTFO bins, look for time, scroll down, and you'll see this command will give you root. So we paste it in. Who am I? We are now the root user. We might want to start the regular shell, so it says bin bash. You see now I have a root shell. Who am I? I'm root. I might read some etc file, password, or maybe etc shadow. We are root, right? So all it took, let me exit the root shell, was that sudo -l give you some commands to run. If the system administrator limits that, then look in the GTFO bins website if you find any of those commands, and then you might be able to escalate your privileges to become root on the system. So it's a nice little trick, but of course the commands need then to be on this list. So if the commands are not in this list, then you cannot become root using this method. But it's nice because some system administrators will limit the commands you can run, but those commands that they allow you to run might give you root access into the system. So they might think it's secure. They have limited which commands you can run as root, but those commands can sometimes be abused to become root into the system. Now, another way to escalate privileges is files that we can access. So we might be able to access some files on the system that we are not supposed to access. For example, the interesting ones are etc password and etc shadow. So maybe the system administrator messed up a bit and we have permissions to read those files. So etc password will tell you the users on the system. And you'll see, for example, we have the user Ubuntu here. It's the user ID, group ID, and also their home directory and their shell. If you scroll up to the top, you can also find the root user with the root directory and their shell. So it's very interesting, but of course we want the password. Now the passwords are stored in a file called etc shadow. So if you open etc shadow, you are able to read that file, and you might find the passwords. For example, this is the password for Ubuntu. Now you might wonder, like, why is it in this cryptic format? Because obviously the password was Jessica, so this is not the password. That's because Linux, as well as Windows and other systems, they use a technique called hashing to store passwords. What you would need to do is to crack the hash. And here, if we scroll up, we have the root password. So you'll see we can copy this line. This line contains the root password, so we were able to read the file etc shadow on this box, and it has the root password here, just right after the colon up all the way to the next colon. So this is the root password, but it's hashed. That's why it looks like this gibberish text. So we can crack the hash and find the real password. So we're gonna save that to a file. We just open a notepad file here, and we're gonna paste it in and save it as maybe root password. So we're going to save it as the file rootpasswords.txt. And next we need to crack it. We can use a tool called John the Ripper to crack this. So let's try that. So we type John with the file we saved it as. What is the file? Okay. Need to save the file in the Kali directory. So we need to save this, of course, in the itself. So root password txt, paste it in. So now we can use John the Ripper to try and crack that file. So the file is root password, and format is crypt. That is the format used in Linux. So there's different ways to create that gibberish text, the hash. I have a course on hashing if you're interested in that, to go in more details, but just remember that Linux uses the format crypt. There's different systems that create this gibberish text, so that's why I specify it with the format flag here. Let's see if it can crack it. So we need to install John the Ripper. With that command, sudo apt-get install John. Yeah, we don't need to do that on the server. We need to do that on our box. So let's see. We have the file here, John, root password, format is crypt, enter, and that will start cracking the root password. So with some time, it will hopefully find the passwords, and there we go. We decrypted this gibberish text. We cracked this hash by typing the command John with the file, with the file content from etc shadow, and then we needed to specify format is crypt because that is what is used in Linux. and you'll see we found the root password. So this attack was possible because we were able to read the file etc shadow. So if the permissions is set wrong and we can read etc shadow, you can then copy whichever user you want, for example Ubuntu. Now obviously we are user Ubuntu, but just for demonstration, we save it as a new file, for example with nano, paste it in, save it, Ctrl-O, Ctrl-X, and then we use John, Ubuntu password -- format is crypt, and that will crack the password, in this case for the user Ubuntu, because that's what we copied, and you'll see it cracked the password. So this might work for cracking the password. So if you are able to read the etc shadow file, then you might be able to crack the password hash, which is all that gibberish text, and find the original password. So this kind of attack will only work if you can access the etc shadow file. I have a course on hash cracking, so you can learn more about hash cracking in that course. Just know that with John the Ripper you can crack those hashes if the shadow is readable. Otherwise, if you want to learn more about hashing, check my hash cracking course. So once you got access into the system as a regular user, you want to become root. Now, you can use automated scripts to find out vulnerabilities for the system that allows you to become root. So just like the ones we discussed so far, like for sudo or reading the etc file, or other ways that you might become root. So there's automated scripts like linpiece. If we open a browser, we can search for linpiece. You'll see linpiece GitHub, and it's an automated script that will search for it. So you can copy it directly from GitHub on your target system. And if you press paste, it will start scanning the system for vulnerabilities. So it will automatically search for passwords, or pseudo vulnerabilities, or other vulnerabilities that allow you to become root into the system. So if I press enter, you'll see it downloads the script and starts the program is called linpiece, Linux Privilege Escalation Awesome Script, linpiece, and you'll see it starts scanning and creates a lot of different outputs with different colors. So if something is very interesting, then it will output that with yellowish red color. So you'll see it outputs a lot of stuff, but most of this stuff you can ignore. What you're looking for is, of course, files that you can read that might give you root access, or maybe default passwords, pseudo vulnerabilities, and others. So running this script will output a lot of data, and it will take a while to run. It's scanning the whole system. If you scroll up, you might find things that are interesting. So you'll see a lot of things here. So it searches backups, it searches emails. So maybe there are some emails in there with default passwords, or passwords that have been emailed. Sometimes you can read the root folder. Sometimes that's not protected. So you can say as a regular user cd root and read the contents, or read some other files, or write. In this case, it was able to read the shadow file, and you see linpiece automatically outputted that. So we have the hashes here for root and for so those hashes that we cracked in the previous lecture. So linpiece will scan automatically the whole system and try to find interesting files and techniques that allow you to become root. For example, here we can see in yellow red, so these files are very interesting. We are able to read the shadow file and the password file. So in the previous video we used that to become root. It automatically searches for passwords in the history file. No, didn't find any, but it tries to search for that. And so you can use linpiece as a tool to automatically scan. Now it's not the only script that does automated scanning. There's also a tool called Linnaeus, which is a very similar tool. Okay, so this is another script, and does automated scanning as well. So you can find all kind of automated scripts. You'll see, for example, linenum. So linenum.sh, which is a similar script that does scanning automatically for the whole system. You'll see when I search linenum, it will tell you how to run it. So you can download it, make it executable with chmod 7 chmod plus x with the script name, and then run linenum. So this is a very similar script to the linenum script you saw before. Now there's also one for Windows. So if you hacked a Windows box, you can try to run WinPeace, try and become administrator on a Windows box. But here we have a Linux box, and that's what we're focusing on in this course. So you can use linpeace or linenum to do automated scanning if you want to. However, you might just as well do the manual, trying to escalate manually by trying to find interesting files, to do sudo, maybe read interesting files. We done in this course to become root. So you might do the manual way, or you might try the automated way. Both are possible.